It isn't every day that your own U.S. representative invites you to open Congress with an invocation, but that's exactly what Mark Pocan did. It isn't every day that the guest chaplain of the House of Representatives bars you from speaking, and it's not every day that the representative signs on to an amicus brief challenging the chaplain for doing that. Mark Pocan is a member of the newly formed Congressional Freethought Caucus, which was co-founded by Representative Jared Huffman and by Representative Jamie Raskin. And in their brief that they wrote, they pointed out that, and we didn't know this, that Dane County here, which is the district, in the district that Pocan represents, 54% of this county is non-religious. Did you know that? Mark Pocan has represented the Wisconsin 2nd Congressional District since 2013. This followed 14 years in the Wisconsin State Assembly. He's a small business owner. He's a union member, a lifelong advocate for progressive causes. In the 116th Congress, Representative Pocan serves on the House Appropriations Committee. He's also the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the largest values-based caucus in the Democratic Party, where he's a strong voice for progressive values in Congress. So it's a real great honor for me to be able to personally introduce to you Representative Pocan and to hand him this award, truly deserved for being a champion of the First Amendment.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, let me just say thank you very much for this recognition of our First Amendment rights. At all levels of government, we need to recognize the separation of church and state, perhaps now more than ever. And let me just start by thanking the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the staff, their leadership, and all of you, their supporters. We are lucky to have an organization speaking on our behalf of our democracy and our constitutional principle of separation of church and state. I really appreciate all that you do, all the work you do in Washington, D.C. with people like myself and across the country. No room in this country at this moment knows better what document the following line comes from. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's what the United States Constitution says in its First Amendment, the highest legal document in the country. And all too often, the words of that amendment have been shoved aside for convenience, manipulation, and outright advocacy for any one person's interpretation of a specific religious belief over the actual rule of law. I have fought my entire career to uphold that First Amendment, to keep a real separation between church and state, to not have a theocracy rather than a democracy. Yet, the encroachment is as aggressive today as ever. Just in the last few weeks, the Attorney General, William Barr, used religion as a rallying call for so-called morality, a morality he mixed heavily with certain brands of political beliefs. And we witness this blurring of the lines of the law all too often. We see it when funds are diverted from our public schools to religious schools via vouchers. Unfortunately, Wisconsin was at the forefront of these efforts, initially giving money to private schools whose founders used school funds to buy Cadillacs, and in one case by a founder who said he could read a book by simply placing his hand on it. Look, if he can do that, there's a marquee in Vegas waiting for him. But worse yet, these schools fail at alarming rates. Most recently, I had the pleasure of questioning our education secretary, Betsy DeVos, I don't know why everywhere I speak I get that reaction when I say her name, but thank you for fulfilling today's. I asked her about the 1 in 4 failure rates of voucher schools with no accountability for taxpayer dollars lost in the process. And of course, there's no real response, as the truth ran counter to her beliefs. Or what about the selectivity of these schools, who all too often don't take kids with disabilities, or who act up, or who are gay or lesbian or transgender, as they might cost their programs more or are excluded because of their beliefs. They leave those kids to the public schools, all while taking funds away from those public entities that need to provide public education for everyone. Thank you. You know, I will never forget when those private voucher schools tried to deny kids who are differently abled in Wisconsin. In my last session of the state legislature here, a bill was introduced regarding this issue to help provide these voucher schools some cover from criticism on this issue. Well, unsurprisingly, the authors put zero thought into the bill because, after all, zero thought of theirs went into it. You see, it was a piece of model legislation shopped state by state via the conservative group, the American Legislative Exchange Council. The only problem, since so little effort went into drafting the legislation, they didn't even bother to change a word from other model legislation mimicked from other states. In fact, the group pushing the bill recommended local legislators name the bill after a child with a disability to make it harder to criticize. And during the debate, they didn't even answer one question on the floor of the assembly about it because they didn't exactly know what the legislation was. Fortunately, that bill never became law. But that's exactly what happens when you give public tax dollars to religious and other voucher schools. You lose accountability and you hurt our kids. We see the complete disregard for the First Amendment by private sector programs with a religious foundation getting contracts in the military, our prison system, and healthcare, providing public services with a side of religious proselytizing directly in contrast to the First Amendment. We get the encroachment when we do not allow non-religious individuals to provide an invocation to government bodies. And I think you just heard our story with Dan Barker. Rest assured that that isn't the last you've heard of us about trying to change that practice. Representative Jared Huffman and I have renewed a request in this Congress for a humanist to address the body, and I look forward to sharing with you how that proceeds. Yet we face that same invocation discrimination as well all too often at state and local levels of government. So if you want to support the Constitution, you have to support the whole of it, starting with the amendments in order, starting with the first one. And that requires us to keep a separation between church and state. But I also think we need to speak out more on behalf of people who don't follow a specific religion or any religion for that matter. I have seen the problems of certain so-called religious beliefs personally. Growing up, I attended a center-right sect of Protestantism. I remember that women weren't allowed in the upper sectors of volunteers in the church. I remember that day in elementary school when I went around saying the earth was really only 6,000 years old after a visiting minister offered that opinion. Luckily, that only lasted one day. I remember the discreet shunning of parishioners who appeared outside the normal gender norms of what a manly man or womanly woman was. Fortunately, I had parents who strongly believed in science, and I had good public school teachers that did as well. But I think it's also important to point out that I've also seen another side of some faith communities worth sharing. While in local government, my contacts fighting for human rights through our sister cities in Colombia and El Salvador, my contacts in those countries were Catholic priests and nuns, usually liberation theologists. I respected their application of their faith in a non-religious way that actually lived up to their ideals, to the well-being of the average person, and not the enrichment of the church as an institution. In state government, the only organizations that worked with ex-offenders to transition back to the community were often groups of faith, and they didn't come with a side of proselytizing in providing that work. And at the federal level, I have worked with Lutheran and Jewish social services in helping relocate refugees from across the globe without regard to their religious beliefs. But what's the moral to those stories? That you don't have to force religion onto people to live the values of a religious faith and also to respect the laws of our land. So I guess when I was asked to speak about my strong belief in the First Amendment, I do it from a vantage point of knowing my job lies in protecting the Constitution, which is what should be the religion to any elected official. Look, when I got elected to Congress, I was asked by a reporter my religious affiliation, and I remember it being listed as unspecified. Here's what happened. From my best memory, I got the call as my husband and I were in Key West, Florida for a little vacation prior to getting sworn in. It was after the election, before I actually took office. And all I remember was thinking, why are they asking me that question? What does that have to do with being in Congress? And my long pause was taken as an answer to that question, as unspecified, as they tried to move on from that awkward silence. And sometimes it gets reported as refused or none given. I was one of the lonely few members of Congress who swore in on that first day, swore their oath of office on the Constitution instead of a Bible. Because after all, wasn't that the document that mattered the most to my job? And I'm proud to be a part of the Freethought Caucus in Congress that works towards the very efforts that you all do to protect the Constitution that we all love. And I don't feel an unspecified belief matters any differently today than the day it did when I was asked by the reporter. What matters is that I uphold my sworn oath to the Constitution in my job as an elected official. And if I don't do that, then I should pay a price from the voters. But I do know that most of the time when we mix religion and state, we get some pretty awful combinations. Just look at the theocracies around the globe. Look at the wars, the mistreatment of religious minorities, the famine of the citizens that are all too often the byproducts of these theocracies. And we also have to look here in the United States, where some try to twist their religious interpretations to breed discrimination. Discrimination against people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or questioning. Discrimination against women and trans people who choose to make their own health decisions about their own bodies. Discrimination against those who believe in a different God or a different approach towards the same God or no God at all. And watching the Attorney General's recent hypocritical appeal to religion for morality, all while he's busy breaking the law, well, I find that sickening. But also inspiring for people like me to also speak out even more strongly for the Constitution as the rule of law. Face it, all too often, how we as a nation approach religion is pretty screwed up. Think of the hypocrisy of a 3 times married, private part grabbing, money-loving, foul-mouthed, if his lips are moving, he's lying, commander-in-chief who cites 2 Corinthians. Despite his obvious charlatanism, many so-called religious leaders flock to his defense. As long as he says what they want to hear in a few key areas that apply to their reading of faith, they'll just turn the other cheek when it comes to all the other blasphemy. And I certainly have had enough of the all too many of the money-worshiping charlatans in religion as well, who use their faith as an ATM. Their one true religion is money, and there's plenty of hypocrisy in that. But I also don't profess to have all the answers. I certainly wasn't elected to decide which form or sect of religion is right and which is wrong, but I do know that everyone has a right to their religious faith, and by our laws, everyone has a right to their lack of religious faith. And if you work for the government, you have an obligation to follow our laws, period, which say there's a separation between church and state. It's really that easy. But it's also very important for the 24% of us in this country who don't follow a specific religion to also have their values recognized. We are strongest when we adhere to the values put forth by our Constitution, and it doesn't make us a religious nation, just the opposite. They said, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It's in the best interest of this great democracy to respect each and every law-abiding person and respect that we are a nation of laws that starts with the U.S. Constitution and the First Amendment. So that's my belief system. And as an elected official, that's the oath I swore to. And I thank you for recognizing that with this award. I appreciate your efforts, and I look forward to working with you for a more just, more lawful country that treats everyone with respect. We can do that. After all, our Constitution requires it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.